For me, I see myself as an idealist. And yet I look out at this world and it feels like, for reasons that are sometimes hard to understand or hard to explain, that the beautiful world that we know is possible feels like it's further and further away, and that it seems like this has to do with nearly every aspect of life, and it has to do with those who are in power. And it's an idea that I know I've explored in my own life, and I've been really inspired by two books, one of which was written by Simon Sinek, who you just saw, and this book is called The Infinite Game. And he, in turn, was inspired by an author, like he said, named James Carse, who wrote a book called Finite and Infinite Games in the 80s. And so we're going to look at some of the ideas that they bring up. But I also think it's fitting that we're going to talk about games today, because this weekend is the beginning of football season, which also means that it's the beginning of my tenure as a fantasy football commissioner, which those in my league already know that's something to be concerned about. In my therapy session this week, I kind of at the end, I offhandedly said, oh, also, I forgot to mention, but I was pressured into starting a fantasy football league. And he looked me in the eyes and he said, my therapist said, that's okay. I think it'll be okay. I have many clients who are pressured into joining a fantasy football league, and they end up enjoying it. So I thought maybe I should start a support group for people who are pressured into fantasy football. But for today's conversation, let's actually go back a few thousand years, and we're going to go back and start with the ancient Greeks, and particularly the city of Athens. They had a kind of ceremony ritual that they would participate in for many centuries, and it was a pilgrimage. They would take this ship that belonged to this ancient king Theseus, a mythical ancient king, the founder of Athens, and they would take his ship and sail it from Athens to Delos every year. They would take it on this pilgrimage, and this continued for centuries. And you can imagine the type of wear and tear that a boat would have to undergo through centuries of pilgrimage. And so that actually inspired a thought experiment that is popular in philosophy to this day called the Ship of Theseus. And basically what this thought experiment asks is this. If you have a ship that, again, is being used over the course of centuries, that certainly there comes a point in time when you're going to need to replace some things, right? You're probably going to start and you're going to have to, maybe after a couple of years, replace the rudder. Maybe a few more years, you're going to have to replace the sails. Eventually, you're going to have to replace the left phalange, and then the right phalange, and then the front phalange. Obviously, I don't know a lot about boats. But as the thought experiment goes, plank by plank, piece by piece, eventually, every last little bit of that ship will have changed. And the question is, at that point, is it the same ship? Is it still the ship of Theseus when there's no original plank from the initial thing that you started with? And this raises some interesting questions about us, about actually our own physical being, our bodies. As Kathleen mentioned, our bodies are constantly reproducing and replacing cells within itself. There is actually 37 trillion cells, roughly. That's a bit of an average. But there's around 37 trillion cells in your body. And these cells are constantly dying and being reborn. So much so that after every, again, roughly 7 years, every last one of those 37 trillion cells have replaced themselves. Which essentially means that after 7 years, you are a completely different being down to the last cell. Which I wonder if that is why you married couples out there get the 7-year itch. You look at your partner and you're like, you're not the same on a cellular level. But it really raises these questions. Does a thing remain a thing if all the parts have changed? I have to give one more example I just cannot resist. In the Middle Ages, there was a practice that was common to have a pot of stew that would be simmering for an extended amount of time. And so what would happen is you would serve some stew, and then you would replace some broth, and you'd replace some ingredients, and then you'd serve some more stew, and then you'd replace some more broth and replace ingredients, and this could go on for days, weeks, months, at times even years. They would have a stew running. There is actually one account of a single stew that ran for 300 years. And this concept is called the perpetual stew. So that again, after however many years, not one molecule is the same of what you started with. And yet, is it still the same stew? Maybe it's even tasting better after 300 years. How many of you think it would taste better after 300 years? All right, you're with me. I know I know without a doubt my grandmother would think so, because my grandmother was always an advocate for leftovers, okay? She would always be like, day 1, that's fine. Day 2, that's when it gets real good. Day 3, that's prime. Day 4, you're in heaven, you know? So I think she would be into the perpetual stew. What does this have to do with you and me and our spirituality? I think for those of us who have found ourselves on what we would consider a spiritual path, we are also finding ourselves identifying with something larger, of asking ourselves, is there something larger than me? And is that larger thing pulling me, taking me in a direction towards an evolution so that maybe I might experience change? Maybe the pieces of the ship of my life may be changed. Maybe the ingredients of the stew of my life might change. And yet maybe that's a sign of the growth and evolution that I am undergoing. And like the old saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. But I wonder if the more things change, at times, the more they actually become what they were always meant to be. The more they become what the truest version of what they are. We're all endlessly figuring it out because Spirit keeps doing something new. We can fight this, resist this, dig in our heels, wish things were the way they used to be, or we can embrace it. We can choose to see it with fear and frustration, or we can see it as thrilling and invigorating. Rob Bell. What does this look like for you? Maybe you had some dreams that you started out with early in life. And as life came in, as you expanded, so did your dreams. So did your ideas of how things would be. But maybe like the perpetual stew, over time, you just got more flavorful. And so the question for us is, how do we actually transform and evolve with purpose, with intention? And to do that, I want to bring in a word that we don't necessarily think of in a spiritual context, and that word is strategy. That maybe to transform with intention and purpose, we need to be thinking about what our strategy is. Are there any fans of board or card games out there? That's a surprisingly low number of people. I'm shocked. No game night for you. Okay. I'm a big board game person, and I'm finding that I'm a lot more competitive than I ever thought I was. I get sucked into a game and I want to win, and I forget about my life. You know, I mean, I feel like a very fortunate person. I have a wonderful, job and great friends and a loving family, and yet I forget about all of that when I'm playing a game, and I just focus on winning. I get totally, narrow tunnel vision. Anyone else like that, or do you know someone like that? Okay. Well, there's this game that I used to play when I was a kid, and it was called The Game of Life. Does anyone remember this game? Okay. It's kind of a weird game now that I look back on it. If you have not played this game, basically, you simulate an entire life from birth to basically death, and for many of us who played this at a young age, you're having to figure out really kind of heavy things about life. Like, I was 6, 7, 8 years old when I played this game. I had to figure out how to get homeowners insurance and all. It's just like, it's a lot for a young kid. Something funny, that I was looking at the rules of this game this week to kind of do a little refresher, and something I didn't remember is that you don't have to have kids in this game, but if you choose to have kids, you have to roll the dice on how many kids you're going to have. You're not in control of how many kids you actually do have, which I think is totally unrealistic for real life, unless you're Catholic. But in the game of life, there is certainly a strategy to be had. And in life, there is a strategy to be had. See, we all have a mindset. We all have a filter through which we take the things that happen to us in life. We take the decisions that we have to make, and we filter it through kind of a set of rules that we have developed throughout our life. And yet, for many of us, a lot of these rules are unconscious. Yes, we are conscious of some of these rules, but many of these rules we are not even aware of. And I think that's one of the amazing things about, say, going to therapy, is that it actually wakes you up to some of the rules that you've been playing by that you didn't even realize. Can you think of some of the rules of life that you've been playing by? See, when we look out into this world, we see some really stark examples of how certain people play their own game of life. Some people, their strategy is acquire as much money as you possibly can before you die. For some people, their strategy is live as much of a thrilling life as you possibly can. That's certainly a strategy, a way to go about life. For some people, their strategy is get the largest family you possibly can. This is a family in India in which one man has 38 wives, 89 children, and 36 grandchildren. I'm sure there are a lot of kids who feel forgotten on their birthday, I'm sorry to say. Now, until very recently, the strategy for pretty much all humanity was to survive. That was the rules of the game that we were playing. Again, if you go to therapy, you might uncover the fact that we are still often operating with some strategies of survival. Yet the thing that all these different examples have in common is they tend to relate to our small self. They tend to relate to how I can sort of serve my needs, maybe the needs of my close circle. And yet what the spiritual path does is it encourages us to identify with something larger. Maybe it encourages us to become conscious of some of the old strategies that are no longer serving us. And maybe it also invites us to develop some new strategies, maybe to play an entirely different kind of game. But make no mistake, friends, whether you are a monk or a billionaire, it is still a choice. It is still a strategy. Whether you've chosen a more spiritual life or a more material life, you are still playing by a set of rules. And so this is where I find that this book, Finite and Infinite Games, actually lays out what these rules are in a really fascinating way. James Carse was actually a theologian, and though many people might not think of this as a theological book, I do find that there is a beautiful kind of poetry and even theology to what he says in this book. And this is the basic premise. There are at least two kinds of games. One could be called finite, the other infinite. A finite game is played for the purpose of winning, an infinite game for the purpose of continuing the play. And he goes on to lay it out like this. In a finite game, there is a defined endpoint. You know when the game will end. And there are clear winners and losers. We all know games that operate like this. Most of the games that we play in life operate like this. And yet there is also an infinite game. And in this game, there is no endpoint. And the purpose, the intention of all players is to simply keep the game in play. Now, a great example of this is sports. See, today, the Seattle Seahawks, my team, are going to play the Los Angeles Rams. And in that is going to be a finite game. There is a defined endpoint. There are 4 quarters. And there is a clear winner and loser. In this case, the Seattle Seahawks will be the clear winner. But the sport of football is an infinite game. You can win a matchup of football, but you can't win football. There is no end to football. I mean, maybe one day, but there is no end. The goal of the sport is just to keep going. Think about your job. You know, you're gonna experience certainly wins and losses in your job. You're also going to probably, be involved in projects and things that have clear endpoints. But you can't win your career. You are constantly evolving, constantly growing. Even those of you in this room who are retired, who I know personally, I see that you are constantly challenging yourself, constantly continuing to grow even beyond your initial career. So in that sense, there is an infinite game that is going on there. Think about parenting. Yeah, there are wins and losses in parenting, but you don't necessarily win parenting. The goal is for the game to continue in the life of your child. Certainly, thinking about relationships, you can't win them. And if you try, I know in my own experience, winning in a relationship feels good for like 2 seconds. And then, So there are all these finite games that we play that are wrapped up, that are contained within infinite games. Now, friends, you and I, we're going to lose some games in life. We're going to feel discouraged. We're going to feel like we are unsuccessful. We are certainly going to have moments where we feel low and we feel disconnected from this idea of winning. And yet this reminds us that any game that can be lost is a finite game. Now, the same is true when we win. Certainly, we're going to have moments where we feel on top, where we feel successful. But any game that can be won is also a finite game. And I hope that this reminds us to keep the bigger picture in mind when we engage in life. The finite play for life is serious. The infinite play of life is joyous. See, friends, we get caught up in life's little battles, in life's little finite games. How many of you could say that there is something going on in your life that is taking up a lot of your energy and time, and yet you know that if you were to zoom out, that really this thing does not matter all that much in the grand scheme of things? I know me. I think it's all of us, right? It's such a normal part of being human, and I think we ought to normalize it, but it's also important to remember that we get caught in these finite games. I know for me, I wouldn't say that I have road rage, but I have maybe like road justice. Like I feel really... I just feel so kind of like righteous and indignant when someone does something to me in the road, and I'm kind of like, I hope that a police officer saw what they did, And I get caught up in it for a long time, longer than I should. It's a finite game, and it's truly a waste of my energy. But see, friends, most of our finite games that we play, most of them are harmless. Most of them don't really, they don't hurt anyone, and often they're not hurting ourselves. But yet, I believe that spirituality and these spiritual traditions that we draw upon, they're generally unconcerned with the finite play of life. Not necessarily dismissive of it, not saying that, it's not worth doing at all. We are human beings, and part of life is going to be engaging in finite games. But I believe that the spiritual path is also a compass pointing us towards the infinite play of life. The Tao Te Ching says in verse 38, the master concerns themselves with the depths and not the surface, with the fruit and not the flower. They dwell in reality and let all illusions go. Just a little plug, the Tao Te Ching is in our lending library. There's one copy, so one of you lucky people who gets out there as fast as you can take home the Tao Te Ching. See, the spiritual path that is infinite-minded often invites us to dwell beyond the surface, to dwell in a deeper reality. A spiritual path that is infinite-minded will probably invite us to have an increased awareness of the needs of our planet. Will probably invite us to have an increased awareness of the interconnection that we share between all living things on this planet, and will probably invite us to be aware of the damage that we are doing to this planet. Sustainability, by definition, means a way of life or a way of being in the world that can be continued, that can be perpetuated, much like an infinite game or the perpetual stew. And yet, we know that we are not there, correct? We are not living sustainably on this planet. And we can look at this framework and realize that what's happening is that as a society, as a people, even as individuals, we are playing the infinite game of life on this planet with a finite mindset. We play it like it's a game that can be won. Who can make the most money? Who can produce the most goods? Who can have the most goods? It's all about who can have the most. And we can see that there is an incredible danger when you play an infinite game with a finite mindset. A spiritual path that is infinite-minded will also probably encourage us to have an increased awareness of inequality. Maybe an increased awareness of the widening gap between the rich and the poor. And often we can tell what type of game a society is playing by how they address this gap. And when we look at our world and we see that the top 1% possess 50% of the world's wealth, we know that a finite game is being played. A finite game is about scarcity, that there is not enough, and so there can only be winners and losers, whereas an infinite game is about equity for all. Simon Sinek says, an infinite mindset embraces abundance, whereas a finite mindset operates with a scarcity mentality. In the infinite game, we accept that being the best is a fool's errand and that multiple players can do well at the same time. To ask what's best for me is finite thinking. To ask what's best for us is infinite thinking. Now, the reason that an infinite game is based on what's best for all and not just what's best for me is because it's not about winning. There is no finish line. No, it's about how this day, this moment, this interaction can actually contribute to the ever-evolving flourishing, not just of me, but for all. And there is no finish line because like the perpetual stew, the nature of the game is always evolving. One of the greatest examples we have of that is religion and spirituality. See, many of the major religions that exist today have been around for thousands of years, and they are continually evolving, continually changing. Some, we might say, not so much for the better. And one of the best examples within religion is something like the Bible, that within this very text, there is an evolution going on. Now, maybe some of you in this room did not grow up with this very complicated text, trying to kind of reconcile certain things about this text. And so, if that just totally does not resonate with you, just for the next minute and a half, I totally give you permission. You can just pull out your phone and play whatever game you want to play. You can go on Facebook and look up your college roommate and see if he's more successful than you. But for me, it's been really helpful to reinterpret the Bible in terms of an evolution of human consciousness. Jesus comes into that world and invites the Hebrew people to continue to evolve, just as Buddha came into a predominantly Hindu culture and invited them to think about things in some new ways. And whenever the new meets the old, naturally there is going to be some tension. That when you have this meeting between those who want to see things evolve and move forward and those who want things to be the way that they've always been, that there is a bit of tension. Now, if you've been paying attention, you probably realize that there is no such thing as the way things have always been, because it's always been evolving. But what are those places in your life? See, maybe you might be the type of person that is oriented towards evolution, that is accepting and even embracing of change as a sign of growth. And yet maybe there are people in your life that aren't able to fully support that are maybe threatened by the change that you are going through. And yet you can realize that all of that is just a sign of the evolution that you are experiencing. See, to be infinite-minded is to realize that things are not always going to look the same or not always going to stay the same, and yet that is an indicator of growth and of evolution. Recently, I was having a conversation with a friend, and I was sharing with him that now that I'm 30, I maybe just feel a little bit more settled than I did when I was in my 20s. But that, more than likely I'm going to look back in 5 years from now and realize that I didn't know anything at all, even at 30. And he said, well, I hope so. I hope you look back and think that. Because, see, friends, if we don't look back and realize how little we knew, then we're actually not changing. We're actually not growing at all, right? Relationships will change. People are going to change. Jobs are going to change. And this is all part of the infinite game. Now, maybe you are someone that calls this constant pull in a new direction God. Maybe that's the name you give it. Or maybe you look out and you see that science has shown us a universe that is constantly expanding and constantly getting more complex. There is another name for it. Love, which might be called the attraction of all things toward all things, is a universal language and underlying energy that keeps showing itself despite our best efforts to resist it. It is so simple that it is hard to teach in words, yet we all know it when we see it. After all, there is not a native Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Islamic, or Christian way of loving. There is not a Methodist, Lutheran, or Orthodox way of running a soup kitchen. There is not a gay or straight way of being faithful, nor a black or Caucasian way of hoping. We all know positive flow when we see it, and we all know resistance and coldness when we feel it. All the rest are mere labels. Father Richard Rohr. This makes me think of our motto, love, period. That we all have this choice. We can either move with or against the flow of love. That's it. Those are the choices. James Carse ends his book with just one simple line. See, he goes through this whole book describing all the kind of unique intricacies between finite and infinite games, but then he kind of flips it. He gives a little twist at the end, and he just says this: there is but one infinite game. That all this talk of finite and infinite games really points us to the truth that there is one singular, messy, beautiful, chaotic, mysterious, wondrous reality that we all share, whatever your beliefs might be. So let us be infinite-minded players within that game. Aldea, there is nothing wrong with the finite games we play, but let us not forget that we are part of something much, much larger. Remember that like the perpetual stew or the ship of Theseus, things in life may change. We may not recognize ourselves, and yet that is actually a sign of our growth and of our evolution. And may we remember that there is but one infinite game. Maybe you call it love, and all the rest are merely labels.